your site. There too. All right, Shabbos. All right, Shabbos, say good morning, Afrelich Chanukah to everyone. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Haba Alinu Latova, Allison, Adam Steinmetz, in memory of Adam's grandfather, Rabbi Sheldon Steinmetz, Rav Shlomo Tzvi, Ruvain Ben Shimon Zichron Livracha, Semya Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib Ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Hanach Ephraim, and in memory of their dear family friend, Staff Sergeant Naftali Yona Gordon Hashem Yikom Damo, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's Mishpacha, Leah Bas Shmuel, Zachrini Shulamis Bas Shmuel, and Esther Bas Zacharia. And our Daf Yomi sponsors Eyal and Sarah Steinberg, and the source of continued refuah for Shulamis Chana Bas Sushan. Of course, we dedicate our learning Le'iloi Nishmas, all of the precious neshamas taken from us in the terror attack in Australia. We wish a refuah shlema to all of those who were injured, nechama to all of their mishpachas, and Halabai Chanukah Shem Meretz Hashem, bring nechama, bring simcha, and bring light to all of Klal Yisrael. Today's daf is Tzadik Beis 92, and we are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tzadik Aleph Amud Beis. I gave you a little bit of homework just till the 2 dots. Just made me feel a little bit better about myself. Nothing to do with any of you. But okay, so let's pick up. So pick up at Tashma, which is 3 lines up before the lines get wide on 91b. Tashma. So as I said, remember again, the overarching machlokis that we're still dealing with is the machlokis mentioned in the Mishnah as to whether or not you could make a donative wine offering. In other words, can you just go ahead and decide to donate wine, to bring a carbon of wine to the Beis HaMikdash, or does wine only exist kind of as an appendage to some other formal carbon? That's the answer. So again, Rabbi Tarfon said, Tanakama said, Ein misnad v'yayin. Rabbi Tarfon says, misnad v'yayin. Okay, that's our machlokis. So that's where all these conversations based in the context of that Tashma. So the Gemara says as follows: Yain did Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, wine is poured on the bowls. So also remember again, back in when we were a little bit more fixated on we're always fixated on the Beis HaMikdash and on the Mizbeach. But if you remember again, we spoke in passing about the fact that there were 2 silver bowls that were affixed to the top of the Mizbeach. So Rabbi Akiva says on the we'll call it on the ridge of the Mizbeach, upper ridge. So Rabbi Akiva says that wine was always poured down those bowls, and those bowls actually were connected to like a drainage system. So again, Rabbi Akiva says that whenever you had wine, you poured wine down those bowls. So the Gemara says, Shemen K'div Rabbi Tarfon. So I'm sorry, Shemen K'div Rabbi Tarfon Leishim. And Shemen, if you would donate oil, because Rabbi Tarfon holds that you could donate oil, ultimately again, when it was poured onto the fires. So the Gemara says, "My love, midiyayin kula l'svalim, shemen kula leishim." So do we not say the same way that wine was poured totally down the bowls? So ultimately, again, oil was poured totally onto the fire. Now, what does that mean? According to the opinion that says that you could donate oil, remember again, an oil donation or an oil carbon is effectively treated like a mincha, which means the same way that from a you take a kamitza, so too from oil you would take kamitza. However exactly you're taking kamitza from oil, but you would go ahead and you would take kamitza from oil. The fact that it says over here, that we're inferring over here that wine is totally poured onto the fire, indicates that there's no concept of kamitza by oil, which would seem to indicate to us that oil therefore cannot be a donative offering. To which the Gemara says, no, not necessarily media area, hakadisa v'hakadisa, not necessarily. Although there would be a linkage between wine offerings and oil offerings, lav dafka that they can't have their own unique aspects or details. Amra Papa. So Papa says Kitanoi. In reality, this is a machlokes tanoim. How so? The Gemara says, listen to this. This is actually very interesting. Shemen lo yivchos milog. So we'll say when bringing oil, you can never bring less than a lug of oil. Rabbi Rabbi says, Shloshes lugin, 3 lugin. Okay, so it's fundamental machlokes as to how much oil is the minimum amount of oil when you bring an oil offering. Says the Gemara, Micah Mifli, what are they arguing about? So here you go. Amruka Rabbana Kamid Rapapa, Don Mine Umina, Don Mina V'uki Ba'asra Iki Ba'as. Well, if remember again, this is actually one of like these types of exegetical machloksim which are very interesting. So essentially the machlokis is like this. When you learn, let's say, A out of B. So how far does that limud take you? So for example, don mina umine means if you learn A from B, then learn out A from B and learn all of the qualities of A from B. As opposed to don mina v'uki ba'asra means learn out A from B for whatever you need, but then understand that A could be unique and distinct in its own qualities from B for the rest of the halachas. You'll see how this applies right now. Watch this. The Rabbanan say, Ma mincha misnadvin, afshem misnadvin. So everybody remember again, if the concept of oil as an offering is clearly a derivative from mincha. That's right. That's where all of this comes from. So Rabbanan say like this. So ma mincha misnadvin, Hashem misnadvin. So the same way that you could bring mincha as in a dava, so too you could bring shemen, you bring oil as a voluntary offering. Umina, and we then further continue learning out oil from mincha. Ma mincha lug shemen, afkan lug shemen. Just like by mincha, by karban mincha, you bring with it a lug of shemen. So too, when you do a nedava of oil itself, that is going to be a lug. Furthermore, uma mincha kumtza usheren echal, and by a mincha you take a kmitza, and the rest of the mincha is consumed by the kohanim. Af shemen kumtza v'sharyav nechal, and so too by oil you take a kometz, and the rest is consumed by the kohanim. So both say this is the position of the Rabbanan. This is what we call don mina umina. So we're learning out oil from mincha, and all of the details of an oil offering are gleaned from mincha as well. The idach, on the other hand, the other opinion will say mi mincha. It is true. We'll learn out oil from mincha. That is true, but again, not a complete limud. How so? Ma mincha misnadvin. Just like mincha is in a dava, or just like you could bring a donative mincha offering. Afshem misnadvin. So too, again, you could bring a donative offering of oil. V'uki ba'asra. But that's kind of where the comparison stops. Now, the rest of the halachos of oil, we learn out from oil. Namely, kinesachim, just like a libation. Right? Libation, ma nesachim, shloshes lugin, just like by nesachim, which ultimately, again, can be oil or wine, but they're normally 3 lugin. Af shemen shlosha lugin. So too, when you bring a donative offering of oil, it'll be 3 lugin. Uma nesachim kulin svalim. And just like by nesachim, you pour it totally down the silver bowls. Af shemen kul ishim. So too, oil will be totally put on the fire. Incredible. So Rabbi said, Rabbi said, Tabaye. Rabbi said, Amar le Rabbi Abaye, I mi mincha ma'isila. Now, if you're going to be learning out shemen from mincha, to kuli alma don mina umina, everyone will agree. If indeed the source for a donative oil offering is going to be mincha, then it makes sense to extend that limud the whole way, and therefore learn out all of the halachas of oil from mincha. El Rebbe Rebbe doesn't learn out oil from mincha. Where does Rebbe learn out oil from? Rebbe learns out from Ezrach. Now we'll say Ezrach is quoting a word that's written by Niskei Yayin, that's written by wine libations. So the Gemara says, can you say that Rebbe is learning out the halachos of a donative oil offering from a wine libation? Vatan, you learn karba mincha. So we'll say the fact that the pasuk says karba mincha, it doesn't have to say karba mincha, it's an extra phrase. Melamed shemisnadvin shemen. That extra phrase teaches us that ultimately the same way that a karba mincha could be a voluntary offering, so too you could bring a voluntary offering of shemen. And how much oil would you bring if you bring a donative offering? Shlosha lugin, 3 lugin. Okay. Who says that a donative offering of oil is going to be 3 lugin? Rabbi he. It's Rabbi v'kamaisila mikarban. But Rabbi learns that from carbon. Not from carbon. Amarle. He said, okay, I thought Rebbe's source was Ezrach. If it turns out that you have a source of Rebbe, ultimately again from carbon, then fine. Good. Amr Shmuel. So I just want to point out, again, fascinating discussions about the details regarding a donative oil offering, but again, still not discussing the idea as to whether or not you're actually allowed to bring a donative offering. That is still subject to machlokes, which will resolve Mershon at the end of the parak. So the Gemara says as follows. Let's go weiter. Amr Shmuel. Hamisnadev yayin maybe umizalfal gabe ishim. If you go ahead and you bring a donative offering of wine, a donative wine libation, what do? You sprinkle it on the fires, which is another way of saying that although wine libations are normally poured down the silver bowls, right, the shisin over here, over the kosos, over here, you'll go ahead and you'll actually pour it on the fires. So where does he hear this distinction? Because again, when wine is brought as an accompanying libation, it's going to be poured down the silver bowls along the ridgeline of the mizbeach. When it is brought as its own donative offering, it will actually be poured onto the fires of the Mizbeach. To which the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason for that? Amakra, v'yayin takriv l'nesach, chatziyahin, isha reach nichoach la'Hashem. So again, I will say, so essentially what you see over here is like this. There's the ability to go ahead and offer up wine as a nesach, right, as nesachim, and there's also the opportunity to offer it up as ishe reach nichoach la'Hashem. When is it offered up as ishe reach nichoach la'Hashem? Ultimately, again, when it's being offered up as its own donative offering. I v'ha kamachabi. I will say there's a problem. This is actually quite amazing. But by pouring wine on the mizbeach, or by pouring wine on the fire, you're extinguishing the fire. As you're going to see, there is a biblical prohibition, ultimately again, of extinguishing the fire on the mizbeach. Lo sichbeh. You're not allowed to extinguish the fire on the mizbeach. So if so, how are you allowed to pour wine there? So this is actually very interesting. Kibui b'miktsas lo shmei kibui. Partial extinguishing is not called extinguishing, which I will say, by the way, is a tremendous Musar Haskell also, right? Because often in life we extinguish things. We commit averos, we make poor choices, and we extinguish parts of our holiness. This is Ma'asim B'chol Yom, that we extinguish parts of our personalistic kedusha. And sometimes when we extinguish parts of our personalistic holiness, we think that we're done. We think that we're down and out. We think that it's over. And comes Mesechas Zevachim to the rescue and says, no, kibui b'miktsas lo shmei kibui. A partial extinguishment as a result of life mistakes and wrong turns is not good, but don't think you're down and out. You're not totally extinguished. You're not totally out. You made some mistakes, but the fire still continues on. Incredible. Ini, is that so? That partial extinguishing is okay? Listen to this. If you take a coal off the pyre of the altar, right? If you go and you take a coal off the mizbeach and you extinguish it, you are chayiv. So what do you see from there? That partial extinguishing is problematic, to which the Gemara says, Deleka elahai, right? What's the issue? The issue is, the Gemara's talking about a case over there where that's the only coal of the Mizbeach. Okay? That was the only coal. And therefore, because it's the only coal, therefore, Allah Chalamaisi, you chayiv. To which the Gemara says, Ibai Seima, Kiboy de mitzvah shiny. It could also very well be different that, again, I will say, you're right, normally partial extinguishing is problematic. That's problematic. But what's happening over here? This is an extinguishing for the purpose of a mitzvah. Perhaps that's mutter. Remember again, this is not, when do we say that partial extinguishing is problematic? If halacha l'maisa, you're doing it for no reason. But over here, by pouring wine in the mizbeach, that's for the purpose of a mitzvah. Purpose of a mitzvah would be mutter. So let's analyze this a bit more. To which the Gemara says also is interesting that sometimes there's a kiboy de mitzvah. Sometimes it's incredible. Sometimes, and this is a strange dynamic that we often encounter, which is sometimes in order to go ahead and do something good, you have to extinguish a part of yourself. What do I mean by that? We find this all the time. I will say there's this constant tension between, on one hand, being a Jew who's focused on his own growth versus being a Jew who is committed to the growth of community. So very often, when you participate in the kihilo, you participate in community. How are you defining community? Whether it's your little community, or like a shul, whether it's Klal Yisrael. So it's always so much easier just to focus on your own growth. Sometimes when you get involved in things for the kihilo, you get involved in things for the community, You have to give up things from yourself. You do. You give up time from yourself. You give up energy from yourself. And so a person can sometimes feel like, I'm not growing as a person. To which the Gemara says, sometimes, kiboy de mitzvah shayni. Sometimes, even if you feel yourself extinguished a little bit, but you're giving to the cloud, you're giving to the collective, you're giving to the community, even though you are suffering a little bit of extinguishment as a result of that, that at the end of the day, Baruch Hashem, is considered to be still part of the beautiful mitzvah. Tashma, the Tan Rabbi Lazar ben Rabbi Yaakov, klape shenasnu Torah litrom, Yochel Yichabe v'Yitrom. Supposed to listen to this. Now remember, every day there's Trumas Hadeshen. What's Trumas Hadeshen? You're taking ash off the Mizbeach. So I might have thought that since there's a din ultimately of removing ash from the Mizbeach, Yochel Yichabe v'Yitrom, you might have thought that halacha l'maisa again, you could extinguish coals, you could extinguish fire and then remove it from the Mizbeach. So Gemara says, Amrit lo yichbe. Pasuk says, lo yichbe. No, you can't extinguish anything from the Mizbeach. Now I was saying, what now? Again, why is the Gemara bringing this up? Because you just got finished saying, the Gemara just got finished saying that maybe kiboy de mitzvah. Maybe if you're extinguishing for the purpose of a mitzvah, ultimately that's mutter. Well, here the Gemara clearly says it's not mutter, because here the Gemara says even in the course of Trumas Hadeshen, taking off the ash of the Mizbeach, you can't extinguish while taking off the ash. So you see over here that even kiboy for a mitzvah is not mutter. To which the Gemara says, Shani Hasam Efshar Diyasiv V'Natar. The Gemara says, no. The difference over there is you could sit there and wait. You can sit there and wait. There's no need to extinguish a coal before Trumas Hadeshen. Just wait till it goes out, and therefore, again, you could take it off. As opposed to, let's say, pouring wine on the Mizbeach. If that's a donative offering, you can't wait. It has to be offered there as well. Tashma. Shabbos says, so therefore the Gemara seems to end off over here that halacha l'maisa, if you have a donative offering of wine, in fact, you do pour it on the Mizbeach. What about the fact that that's some semblance of extinguishing? The Gemara seems to indicate that kiboy de mitzvah is shiny. Although there may be some level of extinguishing, but since it's being done for the purpose of a mitzvah, ultimately, again, it's going to be mutter. Incredible. Tashma, yain k'div Rabbi Kiva l'svalim, shemen k'div Rabbi tarfan li'ishim. So wine, Rabbi say, wine, if you bring a donative offering of wine, we go like Rabbi Kiva that is poured in the bowls on the top of the Mizbeach. And if you bring a donative offering of oil, ultimately, again, that is poured on the fires. Va'o tanya, yayin nesech l'svalim, o eino ela l'ishim. And Rabbi saying about the yayin nesech over here. Remember, it's nesech from lashon of nesachim, right? Not like idolatrous wine. So if you're going ahead, right? If you're going ahead and you're bringing an offering of wine, so where does that go? That goes into the silver bowls on top of the mizbeach. O eino ela l'ishim. Maybe not. Maybe it gets poured on the fires. Right, if it's a carbon. To which the Gemara says, Amrit lo yichbe. The pasuk says you can't extinguish it. So we just said, lo kashya ha Rabbi Huda ha Rabbi Shimon. Shabbos said this is great. So the Gemara says this is actually a machlokes Huda Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi said, what machlokes over here we're talking about? Davar she'enu miskaven. Right, Rabbi said this is such a great sugi by Hilchos Shabbos. Davar she'enu miskaven means you do something without intention. What's a good example of that? I pour wine on the mizbeach. What happens when you pour wine on the mizbeach? What happens? What happens? You're going to definitely extinguish some of the fire. But that's not my kavanah. What's my kavanah? My kavanah is to offer up a carbon. So what is the status, ultimately, again, of a davar she'enu miskaven? So this is a machlokes Rabbi Huda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Huda holds that a davar she'enu miskaven is aser. Rabbi Huda holds that it is aser. Rabbi Shimon holds that it is mutter. Based on that, the Gemara says that Rabbi Huda would hold that halacha l'maisi you can't pour wine on the mizbeach because you're going to end up extinguishing, even though it's not your intention, it's still aser. Rabbi Shimon would say ultimately again that it is mutter. L'meimra, the Shmuel Rabbi Shimon Silber. So you're telling me then that Shmuel himself holds like Rabbi Shimon that davar she'enu miskaven is mutter. V'amar Shmuel, listen to this. Mechabin gacheles shamatachas birshos harabim birshos shelo yazuko borabim. So we'll say Hilchos Shabbos case. That's very interesting. You can go ahead if you have a coal of metal. We'll say now really what it means is you have a glowing piece of metal. A glowing piece. Gemara calls it a coal. You have a glowing piece of metal. You could extinguish that on Shabbos in order that the public should not be on. Obviously, that's a public danger. You could extinguish it. However, top of Tzadik Beis, 92a, avalo gacheles shal eitz. But interestingly enough, you can't extinguish a burning piece of wood. Why? Because interestingly enough, a burning piece of wood, when you extinguish it, creates coal. A burning piece of metal, when you extinguish it, doesn't create anything. It's just the same piece of metal. And if you think that Shmuel holds, so again, so in Pashtus, that's the distinction that Shmuel is making. You could extinguish metal because you're saving the public from a public danger, and you're not creating anything. You can't extinguish wood because you are creating a piece of coal. But one second, but if Shmuel holds like Rabbi Shimon, that a davar she'eino miskaven is mutter, then what? Afilu gacheles shal eitz nami. Then ultimately you should be even able to extinguish a burning piece of wood. Why? Because even though you end up creating a piece of coal, that's not your intention. And davar she'eino miskaven is mutter. To which the Gemara says, the davar she'eino miskaven several like Rabbi Shimon. Now in reality, the davar she'eino miskaven, he holds like Rabbi Shimon. Ultimately, again, that it is mutter. However, b'melacha she'ein tzricha legufa, but I will say again, there's a different detail over here. Melacha she'ein tzricha legufa, ultimately again, is a melacha that you perform, but you're not performing it for its intended purpose, right? So again, for example, over here, the way you would make coal is you would extinguish the fire on the piece of wood. So you're doing the malacha, but the malacha is not being done for its intended purpose. It's not being done to create coal. Rather, again, it's being done ultimately what? To save the public from danger. But in that case, he holds like Rabbi Huda, who holds that it is aser. Okay, incredible. So let's finish up the parak. Amar Rav Huna, Zevachim shenitmu osel and ma'aracha b'fnei atzman v'sarfan. So this is very interesting. If you have wine libations, or for that matter, again, oil libations as well. The Gemara says that become tameh. So where do you dispose of them? So the Gemara says you make a pyre in the Beis HaMikdash itself. Rashi points out over here, al haritzpa ba'azara. So literally, again, you make a pile of wood, you make a pyre, P-Y-R-E, right? A pyre on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash, on the floor of the Azara, on the floor of the courtyard, and you burn the invalid oil or wine right there. Now, as opposed to, remember, generally, when karbanos become disqualified, where do you take them? There's a Beis Hadeshan, there's a place outside to burn disqualified sacrificial matter. Not when it comes to Nesachim, not when it comes to libations. Those you take care of right on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash itself. Mishum shenemar, because the pasuk says, Bakodesh ba'ish tisaref. Pasuk says, you shall burn them in the Kodesh. In the Kodesh itself. Tainami Hachi, Bryce supports this. Hadam v'Hashem v'Amenachos v'Anasachim shenitmu. Okay, so now we just expanded this category a lot. It's blood, oil, mincha, and nisachim, and libations. And libations that became tameh. Osim lahan ma'arach b'fnei asman. You make for them a pyre on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash. And what for sarfa? And you burn them right there. So Shmuel said to Rav Chana Bagarata, I see li be'asara. I like this. Listen to this. He says, I love this halacha. I love this halacha. So here's what I want you to do. Get 10 people together, get a minyan together. Ve'emulacha kamayu. And I want to announce in front of this group of 10, Nisachim shenitmu, that when libations become tameh, oselahan ma'aracha b'fnei atzman, this sarfan. We'll make a pyre on the floor of the Beis HaMikdash, and we'll burn them right here, right here, without taking them out. So obviously the idea of getting a minyan together is a way, if you want to publicize something, tell it to 10 Jews, right? Tell it to 5 Jews, right? But again, for the right, tell it to 2 Jews, right? But Lamaisa, again, over here, get 10 Jews together, publicize the halacha. So it's just a fascinating halacha that the parak ends with, which is whenever you have this category of nisachim, dam, shemen, menachos, if they become tameh, you don't take them out of the Beis HaMikdash to burn them. Rather, you make a fire inside of the Beis HaMikdash itself, burn it right then and there. I will say, just before we officially finish the parak, so what is the halacha? Can you make a donative offering of oil and wine, right? Because that was the machlokes in the Mishnah. And again, what's the resolution? So the Rambam paskins in Hilchos Ma'aser Karbanos, parak tes zayin halacha yud dalet, chapter 6, bless you, chapter 16, halacha 14. Here we go. Mishes nadev shemen ketzad osin. Kometz mimenu kometz v'nosen alav melach v'zarka al gabe ha'ishim v'sha'ar nechal ha'kohanim kishir minchos v'cheitzad. So we'll say. So again, the Rambam paskins, you can make a donative offering of oil. That's how he paskins. You actually can, and in fact, he says you do kamitza. However that's circuitous. Somebody asked me yesterday, who asked me about when you do kamitza with oil, what's the halacha of like the residual on your hands? I don't remember who asked me that, By mincha time. Okay, right. That I don't know. I have to look. I forgot to look last night, like on the commentaries on the Rambam. But the Rambam literally paskin. So you could pledge literally again a nedava of oil, do kamitza, put down on the mizbeach, and the rest of the oil ultimately is consumed by the kohanim. Now, what about, listen to this, Keitzad osin beyayin haba b'fnei atzmo, same idea. Halacha l'maisa, you could also bring a donative offering of wine. Here Rabbi say there's no kamitza. What do you do with a donative offering of wine? Umenasko kulan al gabe hashisin. So this is very interesting. So a donative offering of oil is treated like a carbon mincha, and therefore again you take the kamitza, put that on the mizbeach, the rest is given to the kohanim. A donative offering of wine is treated like a general wine libation, which means you take it up to the top of the mizbeach, pour it down the silver bowls, and that's it. So there's no part of it that's consumed by the kohanim. It is all poured down the silver bowls of the mizbeach. Incredible. Hadrun alach kol atad. You're both saying mazel tov, mazel tov, mazel tov. Okay, celebrate. Let's move on. Dam chatos. Shenitas al ha-beged. We'll say, now watch this. It's actually a very interesting halacha. Right? If you have dam chatos, right? You have chatos blood that's splattered on the clothing of the kohen. It's an interesting case, right? Which you can imagine. We've never spoken about this before. But what would have to imagine that this was not an infrequent occurrence, right? So you get sacrificial blood on clothing. So what happens then? Dam chata shnita zala bagad harezet ta'on kibos. That requires laundering. Okay, now the Torah itself, we'll see this. The Torah itself speaks about this explicitly, right? That you have to go ahead and launder your clothing. Now, even though the context in which that is stated is talking about chatas offerings which are consumed, which are eaten. But nevertheless, halacha applies. Echad hane'echalos, v'echad hapnimios, tunin kibos. The truth is, whether it's the type of chatas that is consumed, right, or the type of chatas that's not consumed. Now, the way the Mishnah phrases that is chatas pnimi versus chatas chitzon, or chatas nechalos. Chatas that are consumed, those refer to chatas offerings that are offered on the outside, versus the chatas pnimi, which refers to chatas offerings that are offered up. The blood service is done inside of the Beis HaMikdash. Those chatas offerings are not consumed. They're not consumed. So whether or not the splattering of the blood is from a chatas chitzon or a chatas pnimi, either way the din of kibos, the din of laundering is going to apply. Tin kibos shneimar Torah sachatos Torah achas l'chol chatos. The pasuk says this is the law of the chatos, and we derive from there that in fact there is one halacha, one Torah for all chatos offerings. To which the Gemara says chatas psula indamaton kibos. On the other hand, there is one exception to this rule. What's the exception? Chatas psula. If you have an invalid chatos and the blood of that invalid chatos splattered on your clothing, on the clothing of the kohen, so ultimately again it does not require laundering. That bein shaisala shas kosher, bein shelo shas kosher. Whether that invalid chatos at one point was kosher or wasn't kosher, if at the time that it splattered, ultimately it was not kosher, halacha l'maisa doesn't require kibus, doesn't require laundering. Ezu shaisala shas kosher. What's an example of a chatos that was kosher and that was no longer kosher? What's the example? Shalana. Lina, right? In other words, the carbon was valid and then you left it over past its permitted time. Or shenitma'a, or it became tameh. Or shiyatzas, or ultimately again it went out of its permitted area. Ve'izohi shelo haisala shas kosher. And what's an example ultimately again of a chatas that never had a permitted time? Shenishchat chutz lizmana v'chutz limkoma. The example of that would be ultimately, again, a chatos, we'll say that when it was shechted, ultimately was shechted with the intention to eat it, or to eat it outside of its time or outside of its place. Pigel, right? Pigel, that's chus l'koma, chus l'zmana, or chus l'mkoma, or v'shekivlo psulin v'zarko estama, or for that matter, again, if the blood was received and was sprinkled by people who are psulin. In those cases, the carbon was never kosher. So therefore, the Mishnah introduces to us a new halacha. If you get chatas blood on your clothing, there is a din of kibos. There's a halachically mandated laundering process. That is true for any type of chatas, whether it's a chatas you eat, what we call chatas anechalos, or chatas achitzon chatas, or chatas you don't eat, called chatas pnimi. That is true, and the only exception to this rule is if it's the blood of an invalid chatas. Blood of an invalid chatas, if that gets on your clothing, has no mandated cleaning. Okay, says the Gemara, dam chatas. So the Gemara says, "V'itora achos l'chol chatos afilu chatas ha'of nami." Okay, well now if this halacha applies to all chatas offerings, then it should also apply to what? A bird offering, chatas ha'of. To which the Gemara says, "Alama tanya." Yet why did we learn Yochel tehei dam chatas ha'of ta'un kibos? Yet Rabbosai, yet look at the following brayson. You might have thought that if the blood of a bird chatas gets on your clothing, it should require laundering. Talmud lomar zos. Therefore, the pasuk says zos. Now, also, whenever you see the word zos is always a limiting phrase. It's a niyot, right? Zos therefore refers to animal chatas offerings and not bird chatas offerings. Zos. So therefore, again, a bird is not included. So I just want to point out how interesting this is. If you notice, the pasuk says, on one hand, the Gemara says, Torah sachatos, and Torah sachatos says there's one rule for all chatos offerings. The Gemara says, well, if there's one rule, then halacha l'maisa again that should apply to bird offerings as well. To which the Gemara says, it says zos. Zos is limiting only animal chatas offerings and not birds. To which the Gemara says, Amar kra tishachet. The pasuk says it shall be slaughtered. Talking about chatos. It's what kind of chatos does the halacha of kibos apply to? Only a chatos that gets shrita. The both say what never has shrita? A bird. What does a bird get? A bird gets malika. So therefore, by definition, that excludes a bird chatos from this halacha. Ve'ima b'nei achalos hakasa medaber. Well, maybe tishachet teaches me that the din of kibos, the din of laundering, only applies to chatas offerings which are consumed, which are eaten, right? But if a chatas offering is not consumed, maybe halacha l'maisa again, this din does not apply. To which the Gemara says, "Kedichsev b'makom kadosh te'achal." Pasuk says, "Kedichsev b'makom kadosh te'achal." Ava b'pnimi oslo, but maybe it's coming to exclude inner chatas offerings. In other words, chatas offerings that are not consumed. Maybe the halacha of kibos of laundering doesn't apply to them. To which the Gemara says, "Rabbi Rachmana Toras." The pasuk says Toras. The both say so. Toras comes to include what? All chatas offerings. Outside chatas offerings, inside chatas offerings, but again, this becomes circular. If it's including all chatas offerings, then what? Ihaki afilu chatas ha'of nami. Again, so if you're including all chatas offerings, then why not include chatas ha'of in this halacha as well? Miet rachmana zos. No, because the word zos excludes chatas ha'of. The Gemara says, come on, what are you doing? Umma ra'is. The Gemara says, I don't understand. Suppose say, look, you see what's happening over here? There's one drasha that's including everything, and there's one drasha that's excluding something. So the drasha that includes everything, zos toras, right, we're saying includes all chatas offerings, whether you can eat them, can't eat them, done inside, done outside. And zos excludes the chatas. Which chatas does zos exclude? Bird chatas, chatas zos. To which the Gemara says, I don't understand. How do you know to exclude birds? That's what the Gemara is asking. How do you know to exclude that? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. Mistabra de chatas pnimius. So it's really it's a double question. How do you know to include inner chatas, which are not eaten in the din of kibos, and to exclude birds from the din of kibos? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you. Mistabra de chatas pema pnimius. It makes sense to include inner chatas offerings in the din of kibos, even though inner chatas offerings are not consumed. Why? Listen to this. Because they're both side, an inner chatas and an outer chatas share all of the following qualities. Here are the qualities they share. Number one, behema. They're both brought from animals. Number two, shchitas tzafan. They're both slaughtered in the north. Number three, kabbalas kli. They both have their blood received in a utensil, right? Sadi Beis, Amud Beis, and 92b. Number four, vikeren, right? Ultimately, again, they are each placed on the corner of the mizbeach. Number five, etzba, the blood is applied with the finger. Number six, chuda, they're both applied not just on the corner, but like on the on the edge. Thank you, on the edge of the corner. And what number was that? That was 6. And number 7, Ishim. They're both put upon the fires. Oh, that was 6. Right, this is 6. Right. So therefore, the point over here is that again, inner chatos shares all of these qualities ultimately again with an outer chatos. But one second, no, chatas ha'of also shares a lot of qualities with outer chatas. What are the qualities it shares? Shekain, chutz kamosa. Number 1, they're both offered up outside, right? Not inside the heichal, but outside. V'achilu kamosa, and they're both consumed, as opposed to the inner chatas, which is offered up inside and is not eaten. So again, Bert also says, come on, you're comparing 6 to 2. There are many more comparisons that chatas panimi has with chatas chitzon than chatas ha'of has with chatas chitzon. So therefore, I based on this, the Gemara says it makes sense to say that the pasuk is coming to include chatas panimi in the din of kibus, in the din of laundering, and excluding chatas ha'of from the din of kibbutz. Incredible. Okay. Rav Yosef says, Amakra yochlena. Pasuk says you shall eat it. Lezu v'lo la'acheres. So it means the din of kibbutz applies to this and not to others. B'ne'echalos mi'et hakosov. Ultimately, again, so the Torah is coming to go ahead and limit this to karbanos that are consumed. Ve'ela zos lamali. So what does zos come to do? Ilav zos, were it not zos, hava amina yochlenu archi dekra kamashmalan. I would have thought that yochlenu ultimately again is just the common verbiage of the pasuk. Okay, kamashmalan, that it's not like that. Rabbi Amar Rabba says Omerkra asher yaza bazos hakasam medaber. So Rabbi says again the pasuk asher yaza. Which karbanos are included over here? Karbanos that have sprinkling of blood. And I remember again, bird offerings do not have sprinklings of blood. To which the Gemara says, even though the pasuk is only talking about karbanos that are consumed, to which the Gemara says, le'inya mariko shtifa. That's true for marika and shtifa. Supposed to remember again, the din of marika Shiva speaks about again how to go ahead and treat utensils which handle sacrificial matter. When it comes to kibos, when it comes to the din of laundering, any carbon ultimately again that has the halach of sprinkling ultimately again will be subject to the laws of laundering, which then makes sense because then both inner chatas and outer chatas have sprinkling. Remember again, bird doesn't have sprinkling. Remember again, I will say with bird, you're pressing the bird against the mizbeach, right? You're pouring the blood out, but there's no, when we talk about sprinkling, I will remember again, what's sprinkling? Sprinkling is the act of, comes first, number 1, Kabbalah, right? So there's blood in a bowl, and then it's the act of dipping your finger in, and like that. With bird, the truth is, bird blood is applied one of 2 ways. Either the bird is just pressed against the mizbeach, or the bird itself is right? Shaken, right? Sprinkle, shakakins, right? Whatever it is, good. It's like that. But again, it doesn't conform to the normative halachos of zrika. Okay, ihachi echanachos echanapnimius. But if that's the case again, then the halacha should apply both to those that are consumed as well as pinimi ones. To which the Gemara says, I'm sorry, ihachi echat nechals echa pinimios. Instead of phrasing it as nechals pinimios, it should say echat pinimios vecha nechalos mebaile. It should reverse the order. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Tani echat pinimios vecha nechalos. You're right. Change around the wording to first mention the inner chatas and then the outer ones. Ihachi chatas ha'of nami. So again, we're just going through this exercise, just according to different opinions, tackling the issue from different ways, but arriving at the same conclusion. If that's the case, chatas ha'of should also be included in the din of kibos, mi'et rachmana zos. The pasuk ultimately again excludes chatas ha'of. How? With the word zos. So both say, so again, we keep seeing the same idea. Ihachi chitzona namilo. If that's the case, maybe chitzona, chatas chitzon should also be excluded. Riba rachmana toras. Therefore, the pasuk says toras. Toras comes to include, other forms of chatas offerings. So we'll both say once again, ma rois. So once again, how do you know to exclude birds and to include other forms of chatas? Mistabra chatas behema havelei rabuye. It makes sense to include all forms of animal chatas. Why? Shekein behema, shchitas safan, because as we said before, Animal chatas offerings share the same qualities. Number one, they're both behema. Number two, again, slaughter in the north, kabbalah b'kli, receive it in a kli. Karen has to be applied on the horns of the mizbeach. Etzba, the application is done by the finger. Chuda, done on the edge of the corner, and ishim, and put on the fires. Adraba, chatas ha'of havil rabuy shekin hazal kimosa. But 1 second. Chatas ha'of ultimately again should be included because there's azal just like it. Hanach nefishin. Once again, there's more comparisons between animal chatas offerings than there are from births. Therefore, I will say, bottom line is that what the Gemara has successfully established is that halacha l'maisa, the din of kibus, the din of laundering, which means if chatas blood gets on clothing, there is a din of kibus, there is a din of laundering. Now, what exactly that kibus looks like, we're going to discuss. Din of laundering. What does the din of laundering apply to? Here's what you got to remember. What does the din of laundering apply to? Chatas. Which type of chatas offerings? Both outer chatas, which are normally chatas which are consumed by the kohanim, and inner chatas, where the blood application, right, where the blood is taking place inside of the base of mikdash, which is not consumed by the kohen. Nevertheless, either type of chatas blood in those scenarios will have a din of kibus. Which blood is excluded? Chatas ha'of. If you get chatas ha'of blood on your clothing, there is no halachically mandated halacha, ultimately again, of kibus. Incredible. By Rabbi Abin, chatas ha'of shehechnis dama b'tzavara b'fnim mahu. Shabbos is actually a very interesting halacha. What is the halacha in the following situation, Shabbos? Now we know generally, if you bring sacrificial blood, right? If you bring sacrificial, if you have a carbon, that's what we call a chitzon carbon. It's done outside of the base of mikdash. When I say base of mikdash, I mean like the heichal, right? It's done like by the mizbeach, and you bring that blood inside, that invalidates the blood. That's the general halacha, right? You bring blood where it's not supposed to be, the blood is invalidated. The Gemara asks a different question over here. What happens in the following case? What happens by chatas ha'of if you go ahead and you bring, the blood is still in the neck of the animal, and you bring that into the Beis HaMikdash? What's the status of that blood? We're going to stop over here for today. Again, by the way, shkayach everyone. Great job. We did, it's pretty good. Almost like the rest of Klal Yisrael. With the Daf Yomi cycle, we'll get to Emirat Hashem tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. Not the next day. Thursday. Thursday is looking good as Emirat Hashem as a catch-up day. Let's say shkayach. After Chanukah davening Emirat Hashem in the main shul. Morning.
This to me means like time out. You have to stop what you're doing and stop doing avodah and change right there.